Hello, my dear Franken friends, and welcome to Spookyou, your one-stop shop for all things ghastly and ghoulish. I'm your host, Barnabas Vixen. How horrible of you to join us. Curl up, invite your friends, and by all means, make sure those lights are out. That way it's harder to tell what may or may not be lurking around you. There's nothing like a good mystery, am I right? Tonight we'll feature a singular tale of devilish design, curated by those wicked weavers of woe. And without further ado, allow me to pass the reins on over to our vivacious voiceover virtuoso, Trey Falco, for tonight's sinister story. Please keep all limbs and side covers at all times. We wouldn't want anything to go missing now, would we?
"Were you blind for a while too?" he asked me. I chuckled slightly. "A little bit more than a while. Try 20 years. He nodded. "That's about what I figured. Tell me how it happened," he told me. I gave him the Cliff Notes version of my life story, ending with how I had begun seeing the bizarre, malevolent, shadow-faced entities a little over a week ago. "Your turn," I said after I had finished. Jeremy told me his own story. He had grown up in a much more stable, solidly middle-class family with parents who had actually taken care of him and given a shit what happened to him. Unlike me, the incident that had robbed him of his sight had been a total accident. When he had been 12, he had been goofing off and climbing the big oak tree in the front lawn. A branch had snapped and he'd fallen 30 feet, hitting the back of his head on a rock. He had been in a coma for a week with a fractured skull and a concussion. When he had awoken in the hospital, he had been blind. However, the damage to his brain hadn't been as severe as mine, and after a couple more weeks, after the swelling had gone down, his vision had returned, good as new, on its own. His family had taken him home from the hospital and tried to put it behind them. But things had never been the same for Jeremy after his accident. He had begun experiencing agonizing, debilitating headaches. They came and went infrequently, and then stopped altogether after about a month. But then, he had begun seeing things. He had witnessed his first shadow face, as he called them, a few days after his headaches had ceased. It had happened on the school playground during recess. A boy from a different 6th grade classroom, not a friend but someone he only knew casually, no longer had a face. Only an oval patch of blackness and 2 red, glowing eyes. It seemed that, unlike me, Jeremy's brain, or eyes, or both, didn't need a moment to catch up before seeing these things in their real form. He could spot them instantly. Understandably, Jeremy had been pretty freaked out. He had told the recess monitor, who had told his teacher, who had told the principal, who had then called his parents. His parents had taken him to a doctor, thinking he might be experiencing hallucinations as a result of his head injury. A number of tests had been run, but they'd found nothing wrong with him. His parents told him that he had probably just imagined the whole thing because of all the stress he had endured after his accident and the temporary blindness he had experienced. He had learned pretty quickly that he was the only one who could see what the boy's hidden face really looked like, and that unless he wanted people to think that he was a psycho, he had better keep his mouth shut about it. He had become obsessed with the shadow face at his school, and he had spied on him every chance he got. The shadow face had seemed to act no differently from any of the other kids, eating lunch with them and playing around with them during recess. At first, Jeremy had thought it might be harmless, despite the terrifying black emptiness where its face should have been and its red eyes. Then, a couple weeks later, a girl from Jeremy's class had disappeared on her way home from school. At first, the police had thought she'd been abducted, but that same day, her body was found in a pharmacy parking lot not far from school. There had been no signs of sexual assault or foul play, and the medical examiner had concluded that she had died from an asthma attack, of which the girl had had a history of. She had been found clutching an empty inhaler, and police figured she had experienced an attack on the way home and had tried to reach the pharmacy to get a refill, but had collapsed before she could make it. There were no witnesses, and this had happened 10 years earlier, before CCTV cameras outside most businesses were commonplace. Jeremy hadn't connected this to the shadow face at the time, but a month or so later, he had been walking home from school himself and had first discovered just how dangerous these creatures were. He had been walking down the sidewalk, passing the board fence of a junkyard on the way, and had heard something. A gasp, followed by a muffled cry of alarm that had been abruptly cut off. It had come from nearby, from the junkyard to his left. He had gone to the fence and peered through a knothole in it. And what he had seen was something he could never forget.
Pardon my ill-timed interruption of this terrible tale, but I've been informed by the powers that be that our narrator has been sucked into a wormhole. While our Neutronian technicians work on fishing him out, quite literally bait and all, I'd like to take a moment to tell you about one of our sponsors, Katarina's Potion Emporium. Whether you're brewing up a powerful love potion to ensnare that special someone, or a potent drought of imminent death, you'll find all the ingredients your shriveled up little heart desires. Don't fancy yourself an apothecary? No worries! Katarina has lined the shelves with her very own concoctions, at affordable rates. And right now, if you scream "Spookyou" into the cold night air around midnight, you'll receive Katarina's deepest thanks with your first purchase. Hurry now, this deal won't last long. Now I've been told that our narrator is back behind the mic and, mostly, no worse for wear, we return you to your story already in progress.
10 feet away, the shadow face was clutching a boy, who also went to their school but was a grade behind them, with both hands holding him close, face to face. Jeremy could see the other boy's face was a contorted mask of terror, his eyes bulging. His body was tense, rigid. He appeared to be frozen in the creature's grasp. The thing had its mouth close to the boy's and looked like it was sucking the air out of him. Without thinking, Jeremy had thrown down his book bag and vaulted the fence to try to save the other boy. He had landed in the junkyard. Too late, just as the shadow face was dropping the corpse of the boy to the ground. Jeremy had frozen as it turned its burning red stare to him. He had backed up, trapped, cornered against the fence as the thing had approached him, chuckling. "You tasted good," it had told him. "And you're gonna taste even better." In desperation, Jeremy had fumbled in his back pocket for the Swiss Army knife his grandfather had given him on his last birthday. He pulled out the blade, and just as the shadow face stepped close and reached out to grab him, he had thrust the blade forward into its throat. It had staggered back, gurgling and gasping, reaching for the knife protruding from its throat. It had pulled the knife out, tossed it aside, and started to shuffle forward to Jeremy, blood squirting from the wound in its throat. It had taken 2 steps, then fallen forward to the ground, dead. After a moment, Its face had reverted back to that of the normal 12-year-old boy Jeremy remembered from school, before his accident. Jeremy had paused only long enough to grab his knife, then scrambled back over the fence, retrieved his book bag, and run home, not saying a word to anyone about what had happened. The next morning, Jeremy had seen on the news that the bodies of the two boys had been discovered by the junkyard custodian. Police theorized that they had been trespassing together in the junkyard after school and had probably been murdered by a vagrant who had been squatting there. Jeremy had tried to put it all behind him and continued on with his life, trying to put the nightmare behind him, thinking it was over. It wasn't. Several months later, near the end of the school year, the principal had retired. The entire school had been assembled in the gymnasium to be introduced to her replacement, a man. He had greeted the students, favoring them with red eyes that burned from the depths of the blank, dark nothingness of his face. Jeremy had experienced a nervous breakdown, and his parents had sent him to a psychiatric hospital where he had been diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder. He had remained there for over a year, enduring therapy and more medications than he could even name, until he had finally faked a recovery convincing enough for his doctors to decide he was rehabilitated. He knew what he was seeing weren't delusions, though. Not after the medications had failed to erase the shadow faces, one of which had been one of the doctors at the facility. He had, just barely, been able to function in the outside world, managing to finish high school before moving to the city. "Wait a minute," I interrupted him at this point. "You mean you're not from around here?" "No, my folks live on the other side of the state," Jeremy answered. Something was bothering me. Something he had said before. "What do you mean when you said there weren't as many of them in this city as in the others?" He gave me a look that was half contempt, half amusement. "Shit, you seriously think this thing was only happening here? Fuck, man. This thing is happening everywhere, all over the world. It's huge. It goes all the way to the top." I looked at him, stunned and scared. "What do you mean, it goes all the way to the top?" "Just turn on the TV when you get home. You'll see what I mean," he replied, and then continued. In the time between his discharge from the psychiatric facility and the move, he had only encountered one or two other shadow faces. In person, anyway. The TV had been a whole different story. He had stopped watching TV pretty quickly, along with movies. He had moved to the city 4 years ago, and ever since he had been stealthily following any of those things he encountered, spying on them, and whenever he felt he could risk it, killing them. He killed each of them differently so as to throw the police off so they didn't notice a pattern and link the killings. Sometimes he robbed the bodies after he was finished, taking their money and valuables so that it seemed like there was more of a motive. A couple times, he had even successfully staged the killings so that they resembled a freak accident or suicide, such as pushing one shadow face into the path of an oncoming subway when he had been certain the platform had been deserted besides the two of them. He had learned a couple of interesting details in the time he had been observing these things. Most shadow faces, but not anywhere near all, tended to be from the upper echelons of society, the rich and powerful. Doctors, lawyers, politicians, industrialists, even movie and TV stars, and athletes. They blended in perfectly with society, doing the same things we did. Drink, party, work, screw. He had even seen one arguing with a human companion who had been completely oblivious to the monstrosity wearing a Brooks Brothers suit, sitting beside him for an after-work drink at a trendy bar, about the upcoming presidential election. Also, after you killed them, their faces always changed back to that of a normal person's, adding credence to his theory that they had once been human. Most surprisingly, to me anyway, was the fact that most shadow faces also had families. Human families. Perfectly normal wives and husbands and children who were completely unaware of what they were sharing their lives in homes and, in the cases of the spouses, beds with. I shuddered at the thought. And another thought occurred to me. So I asked him, "Have you ever seen more than one of these shadow face things in a family?" "You mean like a couple living together?" "No, they seem to work solo." No, I mean the kids. Do you think it's possible they can..." I trailed off. He looked at me and saw what I was getting at. He shook his head, much to my relief. "No, all the kids I've seen looked totally normal. That doesn't exactly mean anything, though. I mean, maybe they don't mature until they hit puberty or something." Shadow faces drank and ate normal food like anyone else. But every once in a while, usually after a month or two, they also fed on something else. Us. They'd slip out in the dead of night after the family was asleep and prey upon someone, usually from the lower elements of society. People who wouldn't be missed. Pimps, prostitutes, addicts, petty criminals, runaways, and the homeless. I shivered, not just from the chilly night air. I felt dead cold inside. Jeremy noticed. "What is it?" I used to be homeless," I admitted to him. He whistled. "You really beat the odds, dude, in more ways than one." I didn't respond. I recalled those two guys I had vaguely known from the shelter, the ones who had been murdered, supposedly for kicks. And now I wondered. Shadow faces usually left their victims where they fell. There was never a mark on them, and the authorities usually chalked their deaths off to exposure or an accidental overdose or some kind of medical condition. Occasionally, they'd mutilate their victims after death to further throw suspicion off themselves and their true motives. "And I'll tell you something else," Jeremy said, looking distinctly worried for the first time. "I think there are more than there used to be." "What do you mean?" I asked. "When I first moved here, usually I only saw one or two a month. Now if I'm lucky, I only see that many in a week, sometimes more. I think they're multiplying somehow."
Welcome back, my darling deviants. Well, tell me, did you enjoy that twisted tale? Of course you did. I knew you had that air about you, that hunger for the horrific and the macabre. So, did we spook you? If not, then file a complaint with our complaint department detailing all accounts of non-spookiness you found in this video, and we'll get back to you in 2 to 3 millennia. Give or take a business eon or two. However, if you've enjoyed what you've just heard this evening, then make sure you leave a like on this video and annihilate that subscribe button. Such a small act of obedience is exactly what we need to put the food on the table around here. There's only so many days we can have refried kidney and toe jam hash before I'm absolutely sick of it. Spoiler alert, that ship sailed long ago. Now, I must bid you adieu. I've many things to take care of, and this outro is eating into my day off. Run along now. Have no fear, we'll be here every Tuesday and Thursday to bring you another terrible tale. Go forth, my ghastly gang, and stay spooky.